morning, everyone. Today is June 22nd, 2023, and welcome to the New Possibilities Hour, part of the Will Work for Food project, founded by Natalie Armstrong-Motin in the spring of 2020. Every Thursday morning, Jean Lawler and I are delighted to host another cutting-edge webinar for mediators, arbitrators, lawyers, and everyone who negotiates. As you know, there's no charge for these great webinars. Rather, we ask you to contribute to a food bank if you like what you see. And our generous audiences have been so generous in contributing to food banks around the world in honor of our great speakers. One of my favorite parts of the webinar every week is when we announce the running total of just how much our audiences have contributed. Jean Lawler, would you please do the honors?
With pleasure. Good morning, everyone. As of this week, we've been told about $410,120.57 of donations to food banks around the world. That's just amazing. 500,000 is in sights, and here we go. Millions of meals.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And today we have another speaker who I'm sure will generate a lot of interest and a lot of contributions for food banks. And that's Chuck Kanafi. Ambassador retired Menahem Chuck Kanafi is a former career diplomat and lawyer. During 30 years of civil service, he served in Zimbabwe, Germany, India, Turkey, and United Nations headquarters in New York City. He held ambassadorial positions in Eritrea and Ghana. Over the course of his career, he negotiated numerous international agreements, the most important of which include the civil provisions of the 1995 Oslo II agreements between Israel and the PLO, the Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty, 1994, and the German Fund for Compensation of Nazi-era Slavery and Forced Laborer Agreements. He's also been involved in multiple economic and agricultural development treaties. Ambassador Kanafi currently acts as a neutral mediator for cross-border commercial disputes involving South Asia, Israel, and the European Union. In particular, he specializes in cases with substantial intercultural elements. Chuck, we're delighted to have you here. Please tell us a little bit about the food bank to which you would like people to contribute if they're in a position to do so, and then tell us about cannabis and mediation. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Jeff, and thanks, Jeff, Jean, and Natalie for hosting me. I was a little bit surprised when I got the invitation to be part of such an esteemed panel of people who've been here before. I mean, I think all of the bright stars of the mediation world have been here before me, and I'm really just honored to be on the same platform with them. Today we're going to be taking the donations for the National Food Bank in Israel. As you heard from my background, I spent most of my career and life in Israel, which is called Leket Israel. Leket means to gather in Hebrew language. Yes, okay, Natalie has put up the link. It's the oldest food bank in Israel. It's been around for 20 years and has really been there through thick and thin, even to the point that during COVID, when there really weren't any food leftovers and food waste, you could call it, to gather up because restaurants were closed and so forth. They even came down to the point of purchasing food in order to continue their distribution and to keep their distribution network running. So you can read about them. You can read about them on the website that Natalie put in the chat, and I hope you will donate generously to the food bank. Little bit, I guess, about myself. Jeff mentioned that most of my professional background. I would like to mention that I'm involved in cannabis as a cannabis lawyer and primarily as a dispute resolution expert as a neutral. And you hear at these events, and we had an event just last week in Washington, D.C., which is a gathering of cannabis lawyers. And everyone says they've been in the cannabis field since 2017. They've been in the cannabis field since 2019. And myself, as a business negotiator, I say I negotiated my first cannabis deal in 1982 in Central Park in New York. So that's a little bit of my background. The truth is I retired from the Foreign Service of Israel in 2015, and simply by force of coincidence, a friend of mine had been taken on as the quality manager of a cannabis farm in Israel. Israel was a very major player in the world cannabis scene in those days, and he said, "Well, I've got some legal work for you." At the same time, I was making my journey from adversarial lawyer to collaborative lawyer to a mediation advocate and mediator, and so I kind of fused the two of those things together, and I've become a voice. I won't say the only voice, I won't say the most important voice, but a voice for ADR, for alternative dispute resolution in the cannabis industry. The truth of the matter is that normally when I do these talks and webinars and so forth, I'm usually talking to cannabis people about mediation. And here the tables are turned, that we're talking to mediators about the cannabis industry. So I'm going to dwell for quite a while on what cannabis is, and where the state of legalization is in the state of the global market at this point. And then in the second part of my talk, we'll move on to the specific characteristics of mediation, which, at least for me, make it the go-to method of dispute resolution for the cannabis industry. Besides the fact that it generates income for me, of course, I really do believe that this is the optimal tool to be using in most of these cases. So we'll be getting to that in the second part of my talk. Also, I just mentioned my background, which is a leaf of the cannabis indica plant, a cannabis sativa plant rather, which is because I didn't put any pictures into my presentation, so I thought you needed a picture. If there's anybody out there among this group who has never seen a cannabis leaf or not, and I'm going to give everybody the benefit of the doubt there. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm not going to make too many 420 jokes. I will make a few, but not too many. Let me just go back to my screen share here. All right. And here we go. I also would like to make the comment right off the bat that I'd like for this to be as interactive as possible. That is to say, I really don't want to sit here and talk for 45 or 50 minutes about all sorts of things with questions popping up. So I really do invite you to put your questions into the chat immediately as you have them. And I've already tasked Jeff with asking insightful and piercing questions that come up maybe for him. And please just feel free to bring your questions as we go along. I much prefer it that way. And then, of course, at the end, we'll have some.
It'll be very collaborative, Chuck. We'll call it a joint effort.
Okay. Yes, indeed, we can. You made the first 420 joke and not me. All right. I can just close up shop now. Sorry. In any case. Okay, I can't see myself, but that's really fine. I know what I look like. So we're going to be talking, as I said before, about cannabis in mediation, or mediation in the cannabis business. One of the comments that was made, I saw at the event invite, was that it seemed to be an interesting combination. I don't recommend consuming cannabis before conducting a mediation. I really advise clients against that as well, but if it happens, it happens. So what are we talking about when we talk about cannabis? You know, I'm just going to be bringing up a kind of baseline here, so that we're all basically talking about the same thing. Cannabis, or it's according to its agricultural taxonomical classification, is cannabis sativa. Is a plant, a weed. In fact, it's not just weed, but it's a weed. which has its roots in the Asian subcontinent, most likely India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, that sort of area. It seems to have come from there, and then over the course of time, especially in early medieval times, the seeds came to Europe, and then later on from there to the New World. Through most of history, it's been known as hemp or cannabis. There are other words, other terms that we can use to talk about. Nowadays, the term marijuana is very, very common. And we tend also, when you hear Rastafarians speaking about it, calling it ganja, and actually the term ganja is one of the earlier terms. Again, harking back to the Asian subcontinent, to the Ganges River, and that's where it comes from. Also, one of the terms you hear perhaps as for cannabis consumers is they consume with a water pipe, which is called a bang, and bang is in fact the term for cannabis in Hindi and Sanskrit. So that term is actually from the origins as well. I'm going to go a little bit deeper into certain elements of this and the elements of the history later on, but just to have a baseline on the plant at this point, it carries hundreds of different compounds. The ones that we hear most about now in the news, where cannabis is very kind of an in thing to talk about. First is tetrahydrocannabinol, which is THC. That's the one that gets you high. That's the one that makes people, have their munchies and say silly things and all of the things that you associate with cannabis or marijuana. There are about 100 of those. There are about 100 of those have been isolated, which is a kind of massive, a massive amount when you think about it. It's a very difficult plant to understand. And the second thing that we talk about often are terpenes. Those are compounds which give the plant its taste and its smell. And they're a standard kind of biological material. They're around in all sorts of food and other products. Polyisoprene, for example, is a very commonly found terpene, which is itself is natural rubber. In the cannabis plant, it's what gives it that distinct weed smell that, whenever you're walking past pretty much any park in New York or Tel Aviv or Berlin, you get hit with that smell, and the terpenes are what give it that kind of smell. For a long time during history, hemp has been cultivated. It was referred to as Indian hemp for most of its history, primarily for industrial uses. It has lots of industrial uses. You can make cloth. You can make rope fibers out of it. You can even make paper out of it. In fact, my business cards are printed on paper, which has been made out of hemp fibers. It has medicinal uses, and the medicinal uses were pretty much, at least in the European world in the mid 1800s, mid 19th century, began to be used and focused upon, but it actually goes way back. It goes back probably close to 3,000 years in Chinese medicine. And then, of course, there's the recreational uses, what today is called, in most of the legislation in the United States, it's called adult use, rather than recreation. But that is, that is probably the image that a lot of people have about cannabis use, but it's far from the only use, and it's far from being the only historical use. Today, when we talk about cannabis, and especially the legal cannabis industry, we tend to use two terms. The first term is industrial hemp, and that is plant material or distillates that contain less than 0.2% of THC. And that varies by jurisdiction. There are places where it's 0.1, there's places where it's 0.3. But industrial hemp, if you distill it, if you take the materials out of it, it is not very likely to get you high. There's some interesting legal litigation going on, criminal litigation going on in Germany exactly over that point. But suffice it to say, when we speak of hemp, we're speaking of something with a very low or zero THC content. When we speak of cannabis nowadays, although the term cannabis refers to the plant as a whole, including the hemp plants, we talk about something that's over that threshold. And which is in some sort of prohibited state, or at the very least, very regulated state. and that's where we are. That cannabis is also referred to as marijuana. Marijuana is spelled originally in the U.S. with an H, and we're going to come shortly to the reasons for that, and all of the other types of intoxicating cannabis that you can find, which is ganja, weed, reefer, all sorts of other terms. Don't really have to go into them. I'm sure that you know them, and if not, you can hit me up afterwards and I can give you an entire list of terminologies. The modes of consumption are varied. Mostly when we think of marijuana, we think of people smoking a joint, and that is smoking and a joint. But there are many other methods of consumption, which some of them have been used historically, some of them are fairly new. But nevertheless, when we're talking about usage, it doesn't mean that you need to smoke. In fact, again, from my own personal experience, my mother is in a situation where I think she might be helped by consumption of cannabis. And she says, yes, but I don't smoke. I never smoked. And then I was like, Mom, you can eat cookies, you can eat gummies. And she was like, oh. And so that's an experiment which is underway at this point. Hasn't taken off yet, but I'm still trying to convince her. So you have edibles, edibles and comestibles. Again, this triggers thoughts usually of space brownies, especially people taking THC infused brownies and giving them to an unwitting person. But that really doesn't help. That doesn't happen very much. Over the course of the past few decades, there have been some pharmaceuticals developed which are based on THC, which are based on the cannabis plant, the molecule. Currently, there are a number of medical conditions for which pharmaceutical cannabis, and that's different from medical cannabis, we can speak about that too, but pharmaceutical cannabis, the most common one I think is Marinol that we know about. It's given normally to patients who are being treated with chemotherapy to counteract the side effects of chemotherapy. There are other drugs which are used in cases of multiple sclerosis, and that's pretty much the gamut of the pharmaceutical cannabis. There's not a lot more than that. Medical cannabis, on the other hand, is the use of any of these other methods of cannabis consumption for medical purposes and to treat medical conditions. When we talk about legalization of medical cannabis, we'll talk about some of those conditions and how people are treated with that. So again, the other some of the other methodologies here besides inhalation. And why do I say inhalation rather than smoking? Because there are people who vape cannabis as well. That's they put it into a vaporizer and are actually breathing in cannabis or THC and terpene-laden steam rather than actual smoke. The leaf doesn't combust in there, or it can be also a liquid which vaporizes, kind of like an e-cigarette. There was some controversy over that in 2018. Some adverse effects of people vaping THC e-cigarettes, and there's a lot of history behind that. I'm not really going to go into that. Again, it's maybe a subject for a question. Other methods, tinctures and concentrates. Some people just take a few drops of some sort of cannabinoid substance. It could be THC, it could be CBD. CBD is quite common for medical usages. And topicals, people rub cannabis creams on themselves as well. And I hear with great effect, especially for pain. Most patients with medical cannabis are doing that for pain reasons. So you see, I've mentioned THC and I've mentioned CBD. These are the two major cannabinoids. They're the ones that have been studied the most deeply. I have to say about the word cannabinoid, there's an argument within the community whether you say cannabinoid or cannabinoid. I'm an old schooler, so I say cannabinoid, but sometimes I find myself saying the other way around. But you may hear both. As I mentioned before, THC is the psychoactive chemical, the psychoactive cannabinoid in the cannabis plant. There are a number of it's not clear, let's say scientifically, whether they are subspecies or not, but people in the cannabis world tend to speak of sativa strains, which give you a euphoric and energizing high feeling, according to that opinion, and indica strains, which are kind of more relaxing and give you the kind of picture that you think of the cannabis consumer on the couch, drooling, watching Netflix into the middle of the night, and consuming munchies. So that's more of an indica. But nowadays, in terms of the commercial production of cannabis, there are a lot of hybrid strains which lead more towards sativa, more towards indica. It hasn't really been proved scientifically that they have these effects. That one is more in one and one is in the other direction. But as I said, nowadays the strains are becoming more and more hybrid, and therefore you can't really put your finger on it. The second major cannabinoid, which was actually isolated before THC, which we'll see a couple of slides down, is cannabidiol, which is the one which seems to have the most medical properties in terms of being, first of all, it's not psychoactive, it doesn't create a high, but it does create certain mental effects in terms of relaxation. But it is the element of cannabis which is good against pain, against nausea. It's an antioxidant. You probably read about a lot of miracle cures that CBD can do. That's not necessarily true. It's still being studied. For many years, because of the illegality of cannabis, CBD couldn't be studied really to actually do double-blind controlled placebo tests. Those are being done now. We do have a lot of anecdotal information of it being helpful in a lot of cases, especially for treatment of epilepsy in children, as well as being a treatment for, as I mentioned, pain and other conditions. I'm going to sling through history really quickly here because I spoke about it before, but as I said, Emperor Shenlong, who is considered to be the father of Chinese medicine, he created the first Chinese pharmacopoeia of herbal medicines and so forth, had recorded the use of it. It's not something that just popped up in the past 100 years or so. It's been noted in Hindu, Greek, Roman text and so forth. As I said earlier, it was pretty much introduced into Western medicine in the second half of the 19th century. Queen Victoria has been said to use it, has been using it for menstrual pain, and Empress Sissi, who is having, I think, sort of a renaissance on Netflix at this time, also was a noted cannabis consumer. The modern research into it, and this is, if we started medical usage only in the mid 1800s, there hasn't been a lot of time for research. In the 1940s, CBD was isolated, but it wasn't really of any interest to anybody because it wasn't psychoactive. In other words, prohibition of cannabis was already underway, and then cannabis was of interest at that point. CBD was isolated, but again, because it wasn't psychoactive, nobody was really interested in it. In 1964, THC was isolated by two scientists in Israel, Rafael Meshulam, and is the one who is credited with it pretty much. And since then, it's being studied. He did not necessarily catalog or was able to know of all of the effects of it, but nevertheless, that was the point where it was isolated. Again, research was very, very limited until recently because of the nature of the illegality of cannabis, and I'm going to touch upon that in the next slide. In 1988, the endocannabinoid system in the human body was identified. There are cannabinoid receptors within the brain and within the nervous system, just like opioid receptors, and just like the fact that there are opioids that our body creates itself, the dopamines, endorphins, and so forth, the high you get after running. There are also endocannabinoids. There are cannabinoids within the human body that it generates, but it's in the situation where THC especially, but CBD as well, which is ingested into the body in one form or another, links onto these receptors, and that's where the effect basically comes from. And we are going to talk here about prohibition. states in the United States, and I'm going to focus primarily on the United States because they have been the leader, and most of the world, I think, looks towards the U.S. To see what to do. Also, that especially that we see later on down in the 1970s when Richard Nixon declared war on drugs, American aid to foreign countries, for example, became also dependent on their policies against drugs of all kinds, including cannabis. In any case, the history of prohibition begins in the late 20s as certain states in the United States, surprisingly California among them, began to prohibit the use of cannabis. The real watershed mark was the founding in 1930s. In 1930, rather, of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics within the Department of the Treasury, by a guy named Harry J. Anslinger, who, if you talk about people in the cannabis community, is really considered to be the bad guy. When he comes on stage, when his name is mentioned, booing and hissing and so forth. He was an old prohibition guy. He made the name for himself during prohibition. He was kind of an untouchable in the sense that he was not considered to be corrupt, but he was a hardliner against all kinds of drugs, including cannabis. Another aspect which played into these hands, and this is important for later on as well, is that at the time, it was just after the Spanish-American War, and there was an influx of a large number of Mexican immigrants to the United States. There was a panic similar to what has been going on in the United States in the past few years about the large number of Mexican immigrants coming in, and basically a rebranding of cannabis was done by Anslinger and his people, and that's the first time that the term marijuana starts to be used in a very common and a very extensive sort of way in the media, which was kind of to create this connection in the minds of the average American that cannabis was a problem of the Mexican immigrants, and so marijuana is kind of a Spanish name for that, and so it seems to be a Spanish drug, a Mexican drug, and was definitely used as a tool of oppression against the Mexican immigrants at that point. And all along the history, history of prohibition in the United States, it has the criminalization of cannabis has been used, has been weaponized for social effects, which today seem to be pretty bad. I'd like to play now a video which shows, this is supposedly a private film that was made, but was basically a privately made PSA to convince people of the evils of cannabis. It came out in 1936. Some of you have seen the movie, but bear with me if you have, and if you haven't, please understand that this movie was made entirely seriously, was not made tongue-in-cheek, but I am playing it kind of satirically, just so that we're all on the same page about that. So here is the trailer for Reefer Madness. Please signal me if the sound is not coming through.
These high school boys and girls are having a hop at the local soda fountain. Innocently, they dance. Innocent of a new and deadly menace lurking behind closed doors. Marijuana, the burning weed with its roots in hell. In this film, you will see the ease with which this vicious plant can be grown in your neighbor's yard, rolled into harmless-looking cigarettes, hidden in an innocent shoe or watch case. In this startling film, you will see dopesters lure children to destruction.
We're going over to Joe's place. Why don't you come along?
We have a date to play a set of doubles.
Oh, you can play anytime. Come on, we'll have some laughs.
Can I go along with you?
Sure.
Hey, I'll see you at dinner, sis.
If you want a good smoke, try one of these.
You will meet Bill, who once took pride in his strong will as he takes the first step toward enslavement.
Of course, if you're afraid.
Smoking the soul-destroying reefer, they find a moment's pleasure, but at a terrible price. Debauchery, violence, murder, suicide, and the ultimate end of the marijuana addict. Hopeless insanity. See this important film now, before it is too late.
Okay, so that's Reefer Madness. As I said, this was a film which was meant to be broadly distributed, as you saw perhaps on the last screen. It was formerly, Reefer Madness formerly, Tell Your Children, and that was part of the making the idea that there was something, there's something inherently wrong with the consumption of cannabis. I'm going to jump over some of the things here in the interest of time. I would like to touch upon the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Substances, an international treaty which most of the world is signed on to. And it has a very interesting classification of cannabis. Cannabis is classified as one of the hardest drugs there is. In other words, a drug which is potentially very addictive and has no known medical use. And this was to a large extent because of the work of Anslinger, who was still at work behind and at the scenes, and was involved in that classification of cannabis. And in the legislation of most countries to this day, including the United States, cannabis is still classified as a highly addictive substance without any medical use, in spite of the evidence to the contrary. As I mentioned before, in 1971, Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs, which was then exported to other countries as a condition for receiving American aid. Of course, part of that was an enforcement issue, was that if it was illegal everywhere, then it wouldn't be imported to the United States. But part of it was also kind of, I would say, from a sense of misplaced morality. Driven. And the social effects, as I said before, it originally was meant as a tool against the Mexican community in the Southwest United States. Over time, especially during the 70s and 80s, that attention became more focused on the African American communities. Enforcement was used to a great extent and for ridiculous amounts. People were being incarcerated for very long periods of time for possession of relatively small amounts of cannabis. And to this day, we're feeling the repercussions of that in terms of families that were cut off from other family members because they were incarcerated for long periods of time. Somebody who was caught with a small quantity of cannabis in their pocket would be convicted of a felony and then would be unemployable afterwards. And the secondary and tertiary effects of cannabis prohibition were much harder. Felt much harder by communities of color, and specifically African American communities. And today, in the form of legalization, there is some attempt being made somehow to right those wrongs through cannabis legalization policies, with some effect. There's a lot of debate whether that has been effective or not. I am getting to mediation. We'll be there soon. In terms of legalization, first was medical legalization because of in the United States, due to the kind of independent nature of states in a lot of matters of public health. It was first tested in California in 1996. That on a statewide basis, medical cannabis had been authorized under certain conditions. It was to treat certain medical conditions as well, primarily pain, MS, as I had mentioned before, also PTSD, post-traumatic stress. Now it's PTSS, rather, post-traumatic stress syndrome, to be treated with it, and some other medical conditions. Each state actually determined that for themselves, and California, being the first state to criminalize cannabis, was in some sort of sense of justice, the first state to legalize medical uses in 1996, and that opened up the floodgates. Nowadays, over 37 states have legalized medical cannabis programs. The number is changing because there are some kind of crazy situations where the cannabis plant has not been legalized for medical use, but certain of its synthesized isomers have. Again, you can talk to me about that offline, but it's a crazy sort of situation. But it's at least 37 states have done that, and about 22 states in the United States have legalized adult use, which you don't have to prove a medical condition, and they've opened up legal sales of cannabis in some form of regulated industry or another. Harking back to the single convention, CBD products, that is to say products of industrial hemp with less than 0.2% of THC, were legalized as of 2018 in the United States in the Farm Bill at the end of 2018. And since then, CBD products can be legally produced, distributed, and so forth. There's a problem of FDA guidance. There's really not a lot of guidance on hemp products as yet, but they're moving in that direction. There are all sorts of other legal issues which have come up. I'm not going to really go into that because this isn't a seminar about cannabis law, although it may sound like it is. In any case, it's big business. It's big business. The green rush is on. The green rush is on. You see lots and lots of players coming into the market. The annual growth rate of the market seems to be about 21% year over year. That's immense, amazing. The global market value in 2020 of cannabis was 23.7 billion US dollars, out of which 20 billion were in the United States. But that has been growing, and projections say that by 2030, maybe a little bit afterwards, the global market value will be over $100 billion. And just to bring it home to Europe, because I do sit in Europe, the 30 million Europeans have consumed cannabis products in the last year. So there are 1.5 million medical cannabis patients in Germany as of now. So the vast majority of those consumers are consuming illicit recreational cannabis, but nonetheless, it's a potential market for the moment that cannabis is recreationally legalized. It's big money. It's big money. And with that big money, of course, comes big business. And when there's big business, legal issues crop up. And now I will be moving into the mediative section. There are a large number of unique elements of the global cannabis market, which in my mind, and I've isolated the ones here, which I think are specifically appropriate to mediated settlements. And we're going to go through a few of these. First of all is the relative novelty of legal trade in cannabis. There hasn't been any legal trade in cannabis before 1996. So, the law is always trying to play catch up. Non-uniform aspects of legality and the legislative landscape. You can have a state which is bordering on 2 legal states and 1 illegal state for that matter. My son lives in Maryland, so Delaware is legal recreationally, Virginia is legal recreationally, but West Virginia and Pennsylvania are not. So it depends which direction you're driving in, whether you're committing a crime or not. There is still a lot of stigma, and we saw Reefer Madness. There are still a lot of people who think that way, including judges and including lawyers. So that is a problem for litigation as well. There are the legality issues themselves, not necessarily the non-uniformity, but cross-border access to litigation. And this, I'm talking about federal law in the United States, but it also holds, for example, between states between European states, or between states that don't even necessarily have any common border. But there are problems in terms of the definitions and so forth. Because it's an illegal substance, there is a question about the intellectual property protection that can be given to not only cannabis itself, but processes, for example, machinery that is meant specifically to process cannabinoids and so forth, and other technologies, isolation technologies, which are coming up in research, whatever, lack of protection for that. The dynamics of strain development, new strains are coming up every day, and it's really difficult to litigate those things out, and it's difficult to get injunctive relief as well. So there's a problem there. And the diversity of actors, I'm using diversity in this in the sense of not in the sense of DEI, but more in the sense of you have. I like to say there are three kinds of players. There are the legacy players who are people who were growing, clandestinely in California before legalization, and the people who had their dispensaries and who set up, and that was basically small businesses. We would call those SMEs today. There wasn't really any big business involved. The second players are what I like to call the green rushers. They're people who haven't had anything to do with cannabis, but they're getting in, they're investing, they're opening up dispensaries, they're getting dispensary licenses, they're growing, and they really have no history there, but they're pumping in a lot of money, and they are heavily financed players. And the third kind are the real big money, the real big money players, and that's not so much in inhalable cannabis at this point. It's much more in comestibles, especially cannabis drinks. But you have Constellation Brands, for example, who purchase a large share. They're the ones who make Corona beer. Purchased a large share of a Canadian cannabis company a few years back, about 5 years back. They've taken an absolute bath on their investment, but still they were the first company really coming from a highly regulated consumer industry to get in there. So you have players like that, big players who are lurking around at the edges, and some serious big players now as well. And the social justice considerations, I mentioned those. I'm not really going to go into it, but I think that there's a lot of room for transformative mediation, community mediation, restorative justice in those, and we're going to leave that for another day, perhaps. So how does mediation give us actually the answers to these difficulties? And I'm saying things that most mediators know. I'm going over the kind of principles that you probably learned in your 40-hour course at the beginning. But nevertheless, the application is a little bit interesting here. It should be intuitive, but you kind of need a little bit deeper understanding of the cannabis industry to see how that works. So, for example, the novelty, and this brings up the question of industry expertise, especially in IP matters. There's, of course, the debate within the mediation community about whether industry expertise is necessary or even desirable for your mediator. One school says, no, because industry expertise is a form of bias. That is to say, you might have a mediator who knows something about cannabis and therefore is coming in with a form of a kind of bias. But on the other hand, the kind of vagaries of the industry and the developments in the industry, and especially the fact that when we're doing commercial mediations, it's normally fairly compact over 1 day, maybe 1.5 days. You don't have a lot of time to educate the mediator. As an advocate, you don't have a lot of time to educate the mediator about the difference between CBD and THC, and CBD and THC levels in a strain, for example, that you're negotiating. So industry expertise can be a good bulwark against the novelty of the field. There are people who understand it. There are cannabis mediators and arbitrators. If you ask JAMS or AAA, they have people there who have those sort of expertise. I have that sort of expertise. So that's a good counter to the novelty. The non-uniformity of legislation, of course, when we mediate, we're creating collaborative norms. We're creating the norms that work between the two parties in the particular dispute. And so then the fact that the law in New York State and the law in Pennsylvania are different doesn't necessarily mean that we can't come to some sort of an agreement, but it would give us difficulties in trying to enforce it in court. We would then be, of course, involved in endless litigation over choice of laws, and you don't have that in mediation, of course. Stigma is a big one. Again, as I mentioned before, your judge may think cannabis is evil, and therefore may support a decision-making process which goes to restrain the business as much as possible. And you have kind of this tension between, the freedom of occupation and what your particular judge thinks about that. And I'm not going to go into. You don't choose your judge. Basically, you don't know who was appointed, and there's a problem there. In mediation, of course, you have you choose your mediator so you can guarantee neutrality. You can ask questions. You can you can say, do you have any experience in this? Do you not have any experience? What do you think of it? And you can work with neutrality and lack of previous bias, not in the sense of bias in terms of industry knowledge, but you can to a large extent guarantee or at least strive for that your mediator does not have bias against a healthy and a robust cannabis trade. In federal courts in the United States, the illegality defense is a problem. That means, suppose that I have a farm in Nevada growing for a dispensary in California, a distance of 3 or 4 miles over the border, for example. There is a problem to sue in California court, and there is a problem to sue in Nevada court under certain circumstances. And then the answer in the US, at least, is to go to federal court. But in federal court, cannabis is still illegal. It is still a Schedule I drug, which is highly addictive and with no valid medical uses. And therefore, one party could theoretically, and it has happened on occasion, there's no real guidance on this yet, but one party could say this is a contract for an illegal purpose. It can't be enforced. So the illegality defense could be a problem. Of course, if you're in a consensual process in mediation, there are no defenses per se. You can get up and walk out at any time, of course. But if you're both at the table, with the intention of trying to get to some settlement, and raising these kind of technical defenses is not going to happen. Lack of IP protection. Of course, consensuality is an aspect here as well. That if you have an argument about using this strain or using this name or using this product and so forth, if you're at the table, the fact that intellectual property for an illicit substance is not valid, here it is, so there's no problem. The second thing being, of course, confidentiality, which is if a particular process or a particular substance is not trademarkable or not patentable, and so forth, then if you were to litigate it out, it would be litigated out as a trade secret, basically in open court. And in mediation, of course, you keep confidentiality. The same in terms of the dynamics of strain development. You can get to mediated settlements very quickly without other people hearing about your crossbreeding program. Finally, to cover the last element that I mentioned, in terms of the broad spectrum of parties who might be involved there, then the kind of mediative technique of leveling the playing field that we love so much, the fact that you might have pro se parties that are representing themselves. You might have parties that have armies of lawyers as opposed to parties that are just there themselves and with my Uncle Vinny as counsel. And we, of course, as mediators are trained to try to balance those things out and to try to get to some mutually acceptable solution, which is not a subject of coercion because of the size or power of one of the parties. And because we have these 3 completely different types of players that might find themselves, if you have a situation of 2 gold rush investors going against each other, yeah, that can litigate out in court. There's not that much of a problem of power imbalance. But if it's a mom and pop outfit in California who've been growing weed for the past 40 years, and a major company is suing them, this is a chance for us as mediators to shine. So this is a table which summarizes that. You can see that if people want. You can ask me and I can send that along as well. I'm thanking you, but before I thank you, I'd like to talk about a few subjects that I didn't touch on. I maybe touched on very basically, that could be topics for further exploration and further use of mediative solutions. So first of all is mediations within the family or smaller communities. It could be families affected by addiction. It could be overcoming a stigma attached to medical treatment. Grandma is sick. Cannabis could help her, and one of the children doesn't want her to be touching the evil weed, and that's something that could possibly be mediated out in the framework of family mediations. Restorative justice in dealing with offenders. I really can't go into that too deeply because there really isn't enough time. It's a subject for an entirely different webinar. But the fact that people have been offended, the people are offenders often in a victimless crime for possession and how do we go about achieving socially just solutions to these situations. We have expansive restorative justice programs in certain jurisdictions, and these can be effectively used here, especially when the crime itself is fairly victimless. So that's something that needs exploration. And finally, something that needs exploration in my mind is concerning, I had mentioned before, the secondary, tertiary damage that the war on drugs has done to communities of color, to Latino and African-American communities. And there's a lot of work, I think, that can be done for healing in community mediations in those sort of situations. So that's been a really quick look at the possible, the background of the cannabis industry and the possible uses of mediation in cannabis. And I do thank you for sticking with me up until now.
Chuck, that was terrific. Thank you very much. Comprehensive and very informative. There's a question in the chat from Roger Moss. Roger, can you just unmute yourself and pose the question, please?
Sure. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Chuck, very much for your presentation. I've been asked in the last 7 or 8 years to engage with various disputes in California involving cannabis. They're usually real estate related or business partnership dissolution or family divorces, and there's a profitable cannabis farm somewhere that's part of the action. And in each case, the common denominator was at least one of the participants have been engaging in marijuana trade for many, many years. And there was a kind of Wild West mindset that was instantly evident to me, and that was a real impediment to really organizing a facilitated process. It was, and around the same period of time, the first time I had a case, there was a documentary in San Francisco about the lawlessness factor and the impacts on other things. So I just wondered if you had experienced that and what workarounds you might have done. And I'll end by saying there's actually an interesting program I'm consulting with. The city of San Francisco is actually giving money to people coming out of prison to help them become entrepreneurs by going into the cannabis industry. They're running into problems, and we've tried to help, colleagues and we run into this same kind of issue. It's like, it's very different.
Yeah, thanks. Well, there are two questions. They're two great kind of questions, but they do. First of all, they're great questions because and it is very. I kind of glossed over a little bit at the beginning when I was talking about these legacy operators, right? And I don't know how many of you have seen the series Disjointed on Netflix with Kathy Bates, and that's kind of the situation. It's these old stoners / revolutionaries, in the summer of love, we're trying to bring down the system and bring down the man, and they're in that mindset to a certain extent too, although they have these family businesses and maybe they're more business oriented kids are involved, and it is very complicated. That is one of I mean, I hesitate to say this because also we tend to think, in the mediation world that any mediator can mediate any case, that we think we have this kind of superpower of creating collaboration. But the truth of the matter is you have to be able to communicate with the parties, right? And that can be a real problem. Again, in the framework of a commercial mediation where you have 8 hours or 10 hours to do this, it's a real problem to get down and to dig deep down into these people and to find out what their real needs and what their real interests are. The answer to that, the only answer I can give, which is kind of a kind of smart aleck kind of answer, is that during the preparation phase beforehand, that you can do a lot of work with the parties and try to get them into at least understanding what they're trying to do here. And I think that there is on the one hand, Wild West, you can do what you want, and on the other hand, there is a question of and I think there was there of kind of honor among thieves. And that's something that you can play upon as well and say, hey, this whole business has been based for 100 years on trust and you trusting the other guy. And, and yeah, people got worked over and whatever. I mean, here's a chance to, to do that kind of thing. But that's work that I would say has to be done either in caucus or optimally beforehand as prep work. And if they're represented by counsel, then, to bring counsel on board to help tie them into understanding what this process is about. Because basically, if it's that situation is kind of not in a way understanding the process. I'm not saying this is your fault as a mediator for not explaining yourself, but that's, I think, probably the major problem we always have at the beginning of mediations, is this lack of understanding for the process. The second point is just giving me a chance to expand on it, that the money that the city of San Francisco is handing out, that's really, really critical, because there's a problem about access to capital. For example, I can just bring a case of one of the first dispensary licenses in Massachusetts was given to a partnership between two African-American men who had been, I believe both of them had been incarcerated or whatever, and they got this license to open up a dispensary. And of course, they then went to the bank to get a small business loan to open up this dispensary, and they said, no, you're convicted felons. We don't give convicted felons money, and your business plan is based on something that's never been sold before. And so I think that there's that pilot in San Francisco. LA is considering doing something like that too. It's not enough. It's very small amounts of money. As far as I remember, the entire program in San Francisco is something like $500,000. And that it's not $500,000 per dispensary. That's the amount of money that they're giving out, which is just so little to get a small business off the ground, COVID notwithstanding. So there needs to be a lot more work done. New York has rolled out a social justice or a social equity program, which is, it seems that it might be a little bit more effective than California, that it's tried to learn from the mistakes, but it still hasn't done any better yet either. So again, these kind of things, especially lack of access to capital, you may be seeing more and more partnership dissolutions. And even, again, I'm not going to go into the heading of mediation and bankruptcy, but that could also be a growing field as well, if you want to go that way.
This is so interesting. I would love to expand this conversation. I don't want to take up any more time, but they contacted me because of work I do in eviction prevention with a very dynamic interdisciplinary program, a lot of early conversations. And what we're noticing as we are in the real estate space is these systems are being designed and money given out, and there's no advanced thought about dispute prevention. So we've actually moved into that, how to help set people up for success and best practices in communication. So it's a very vital area and interesting. And it's an equity program in San Francisco to help people of color and other minorities, particularly coming out of criminal justice environments, to get help. So I would just love to communicate more with you sometime. And thanks, Natalie, and all of you for another great production.
Yeah,
Well,
Roger, thanks. Really, let's talk, because I'm also, the other thing which I didn't mention at all, but it's actually my main area of occupation is in relational contracting and conflict prevention contracts and so forth. That's a lot of what I do. So we need to talk.
Chuck, thank you. Chuck, we have just a minute left, and we all know that where there's commerce, there will be conflict. And if mediators are interested in mediating more cannabis-related cases, what would be next steps for someone now that they've heard this excellent introductory presentation?
Well, the next step, of course, is to, first of all, thank you for the compliment. And second of all, I would say the next step is to educate yourself about cannabis and cannabis law. I know a lot of mediators out there are not lawyers and come from therapeutic fields, and that would be especially helpful in cannabis as well, not necessarily in the commercial disputes, but in other sorts of situations, families, and so forth. The first step would be to do that, and the second stage would be, again, especially for the lawyers there, to connect up with some of the associations dealing with cannabis and cannabis law. As I said, I'm a member, and I've lectured quite a number of times on ADR for the International Cannabis Bar Association. I can put their address in the chat. Hold on. which is simply incba.org. And there's all sorts of events and online webinars and so forth, and two major in-person events every year, and that's a great way to network and so forth. And once you've built up this kind of expertise and so forth, if you are impaneled, and I say that advisedly, and I'm outside of the US and I'm not impaneled with GEMS or CPR or AAA, but those organizations are recognizing more and more the need for industry-specific neutrals in the cannabis field. So if you start to chip that out and do a few cases and so forth, and you're with one of these organizations, definitely you can get yourself impaneled and have that appear on your profile that that you're a cannabis neutral. Again, if you're talking to people who've already been impaneled by GEMS, they may not have much problems getting work, but on the other hand, having this kind of specialty, if it's something that interests you for other reasons, then that's a possible way to go. But being in touch with the organizations as well gives you the advantage of the ability to network with lawyers. And when people have conflicts, normally they don't call up their friendly neighborhood neutral. They call up their lawyer, and it's the lawyer who recommends what sort of dispute resolution mechanism they're going to use. If the lawyers know that you're out there, they know that you know this sort of thing, and that this is effective in this particular case, then of course, at the end of the day, it's word of mouth referrals that bring us in the most activity.
That's great. Thank you so much. Chuck, I know that a lot of people will be contributing to Leket in Israel Food Bank, www.leket.org. That's www.leket.org. Ambassador Menahem Chuck Kanafi, thank you for an excellent presentation on mediation and cannabis. And with that, we are complete.